She walked into the grand hall of Aldenridge Academy of Arts, with her head lowered, just a quiet shadow beneath glittering chandeliers. Rachel Moore, 31 years old, dressed in a faded beige janitor's uniform, moved like a machine, picking up trash, wiping down shiny surfaces, straightening every chair in perfect silence. No one said thank you. No one ever had. To the students, she was just the cleaning lady. To the faculty, she was like the walls only noticed when something broke. To the world, she barely existed at all. But that night, yes, that very night at a glamorous fundraising gala where they asked her to play a little tune for fun, like some background amusement, Rachel would make the entire auditorium learn a lesson about silence. But this story doesn't begin on the stage. It begins in a cramped janitor's closet where a dream had been locked away for over a decade, hidden beneath circumstances too heavy to carry. 15 years ago, Rachel received her acceptance letter from Juilliard, but then came that phone call, the one that changed everything. Her mother, the only family she had suffered a stroke, and just like that, it was over. The dream was shelved. She didn't go to New York. She went to the hospital, then to 3 part-time jobs, and eventually, here where music floated through every hallway. But her hands only held a mop. Until that night, the headline performer had fallen ill unexpectedly, sending the event staff into chaos, scrambling for a backup. Someone joked, half laughing, "Why not let Rachel play? I heard she knows the piano." Everyone chuckled. But when Rachel sat down at the Steinway under the harsh spotlight, in front of 300 distinguished guests, wealthy donors, and the very people who had passed by her like she was invisible, she didn't just play Liszt, she played her life. And as the final note hung in the air, the room fell into stunned silence. Not a single word. Someone wiped away tears. Someone else forgot to breathe. They had mocked her, dismissed her, forgotten her. Morning sunlight spilled through the towering glass windows of the Aldenridge Academy of Arts, casting shimmering beams across the marble floor. In the midst of this elegant glow, Rachel Moore moved quietly, nearly blending into the polished tiles, pushing a worn-out cleaning cart that rattled softly with every turn. This was her 4th year working here at a prestigious music academy where children were raised on dreams of Carnegie Hall. And among the echoing melodies of Chopin and Bach filling the corridors, Rachel's footsteps remained the only sound no one ever noticed. Her beige uniform was wrinkled, her canvas shoes worn at the heels, her dark brown hair tied neatly in the back. Nothing about her stood out in a place where appearance and reputation were measured in degrees and complex arrangements. She often arrived before sunrise, scrubbing the practice rooms clean before the first student stepped in, and left only after the final piano note had faded into silence. No one ever asked her name. No one cared what she thought. They only gave orders. Clean room 3. Chairs aren't lined up. There are smudges on the glass. But Rachel wasn't angry. At least, she told herself she wasn't. She had grown used to being treated like air, something that moved but didn't matter. Eyes passed over her as if she were just another object, a fixture without feelings, without memories, without a past. And yet, in that silence, Rachel clung to a part of herself she once believed was lost forever. Sometimes, as she walked past the concert hall, she'd pause for a moment. She might hear a student stumble through a wrong chord, or see a little girl buried in sheet music Rachel herself had memorized when she was just 13. And instinctively, her fingers would twitch, thumb curved, wrist relaxed, the tips dancing through invisible notes in midair. No one noticed. No one saw that those hands once belonged to a teenage piano prodigy. And perhaps the most heartbreaking thing of all was that Rachel herself sometimes forgot. She forgot that before she ever held a mop, her hands once told stories through music. "Ms. Moore, please re-mop the main corridor. We're expecting visitors from the Shepherd Foundation today. I want everything flawless." The sharp, clipped voice belonged to Miranda Kingsley, head of the performance department, a former concert pianist who once toured Europe, and now the undisputed queen of Alden Ridge Academy. Her silver hair was cut into a geometric bob to match the hard line of her jaw. Her navy blue suit was always pressed to perfection, never a wrinkle out of place. Rachel nodded quietly. "Yes, Ms. Kingsley. And please don't let me catch you anywhere near the reception area during the event. You understand your uniform doesn't exactly pair well with champagne flutes." Miranda's smile held not a trace of humor. Rachel lowered her gaze, said nothing. But inside, something twisted like fingers pressing hard into an old wound that hadn't fully healed. From across the hall, Philip DeWitt, the vocal instructor, walked briskly, pointing at a few chairs. "Tighter rows, more. Sponsors don't like clutter." Then, as he passed by, he leaned in just enough to be heard. Funny how a janitor knows the exact spacing between chairs. "Maybe you're better at counting steps than counting notes." Rachel heard every word, but she didn't flinch. Her hands kept moving, aligning chairs as if her ears had long grown numb to condescension. Day after day, the wounds accumulated. No shouting, no bleeding, just that aching sense of being looked through, of existing without ever being acknowledged. She remembered once, a student named Lila, only 11 years old, was struggling through Clair de Lune, stumbling repeatedly on the transition between chords. Without thinking, Rachel had softly offered, "Try relaxing your wrist a little." And think of flowing water. Debussy's music moves like a stream. Lila looked up, surprised. Something about her eyes said she understood. But before either of them could speak, Philip had entered the room, and the look he shot Rachel felt like a slap across the face. "You were teaching my student," Philip snapped. "Ms. Moore, let me remind you, your job is to mop the floors, not to teach the arts." Rachel said nothing. She simply lowered her head, swallowing every word, every ache. She apologized, not because she was wrong, but because she knew. In this place, a voice like hers wasn't meant to be heard. What Philip didn't know was that after he walked out, Rachel stayed behind. Her hand lightly brushed the stair rail, her fingers dancing across it as if tracing invisible piano keys, silently completing the phrase of music Lila had left unfinished. In silence, no one saw, but for Rachel, that was how she still lived, still played, still was herself, even if the world never bothered to remember her name. That morning, as Rachel cleaned the grand hall in preparation for the next night's gala, something made her pause. Her eyes landed on the grand Steinway piano, glossy black, majestic, rolled into place at the center of the marble floor, draped in a deep crimson velvet cloth, waiting to be unveiled for the performance. It stood there, a monument to everything Rachel once had, once touched, and had quietly let slip away. She stood frozen. Something inside her trembled, not from the cold, but from memory. Images from 15 years ago came rushing back like an old film in reverse. The tiny living room with the worn, upright piano. Grandma Lillian, frail but fierce, her hands still dancing across the keys with fiery grace, sitting beside Rachel, tapping a ruler gently on the wrong note. Music isn't meant to prove anything. "Rachel," her grandmother once said, "it's how you tell your story," without saying a word. Back then, little Rachel believed every song was a universe and she could build entire worlds with just 88 keys. But the day her grandmother collapsed in the kitchen, half her face paralyzed. Words caught in her throat, everything fell apart. Rachel chose to stay. She didn't go to Juilliard. She didn't walk into a life centered around music. Each day she stayed behind. The music receded further inside her like a flame sealed beneath an upside-down glass. And now, standing in front of the magnificent Steinway. Rachel felt as if she had just lifted the lid on a buried box, one where her forgotten dream was still breathing. She reached out, gently running her fingers along the edge of the piano. The lacquer was smooth like still water. Her fingertips seemed to remember on their own how to press, how to release, how to let a note linger just long enough to break a heart. No one else was in the room. No footsteps echoing across the marble. Just Rachel, her steady breath, and the silent piano, waiting to be awakened. Then, almost instinctively, she pulled out the bench and sat down. She didn't open the lid. She just sat there, both hands resting softly on the wood surface, eyes closed. She didn't play, but in her mind, the music roared to life. A Hungarian rhapsody by Liszt etched into her memory with the precision of breath itself. Every accent, every shift in tempo, every soaring octave exploded inside her chest like a fire long held in. She didn't play the music, but in that moment, the music played through her. Later that day, Alden Ridge Academy glittered with opulence. Banners lined the hallways. Golden light poured from crystal chandeliers, and the scent of lavender from oversized porcelain vases drifted through the air like a hush before the storm. The annual gala was the event of the year at Alden Ridge, a night when high-profile donors, Music Foundation executives, world-renowned conductors, and critics all gathered under one dazzling roof. Deals were sealed with handshakes. Scholarships and future projects worth hundreds of thousands of dollars were decided with a nod over champagne. Rachel had been there since 6 a.m. She had scrubbed every scuff mark off the marble floors, aligned all 127 velvet chairs with surgical precision, exactly 1 centimeter apart, just as Miranda demanded. And then, just before 6 p.m., less than an hour before showtime, the grand doors swung open with a sudden slam. The sharp clatter of heels echoed through the lobby. Miranda Kingsley stormed in, pale and breathless, phone pressed tightly to her ear. "What do you mean? Where are you?" Her voice pitched high, each word stretched taut like a violin string pulled too tight. "The ER food poisoning." Miranda nearly screamed, then fell silent, her face draining of all color. She hung up, spun around, and declared like thunder cracking through stained glass, "Olivia Sanders isn't coming. She's in the hospital." Panic rippled through the room like an electric shock. Assistants scattered in all directions. Professors murmured under their breath. Someone nearly dropped an entire tray of crystal flutes. Olivia wasn't just any performer, she was the headliner of the evening. A prodigious young pianist who'd graced the stage in Berlin, and the very artist handpicked by the Shepherd Foundation to perform Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2 by Liszt. "No one else can replace her," Philip blurted out, his voice tight with dread. "We'll have to cancel that piece," Miranda hissed, clutching the strap of her handbag like a lifeline, her eyes darting wildly for a plan B. And then a voice rose from the edge of the room, hesitant but clear. I know someone who can play it." All heads turned. It was Julian Scott, the young teaching assistant who rarely spoke unless spoken to. Miranda narrowed her eyes. "Who are you talking about? None of our students can wait. You're not suggesting—" "Don't tell me you're thinking of—" Julian said nothing. But his gaze drifted across the grand hall to the far corner, where Rachel Moore knelt quietly, dusting the base of a column, her back turned, unaware that a storm was about to sweep through her life. Miranda froze, then laughed, a cold, sharp laugh laced with scorn and disbelief. "You can't be serious. She's the janitor, not a performer." Julian nodded calmly. "But she can play. I've heard her. After hours. When the building's empty and no one's watching, she doesn't just play well, she's remarkable. The room fell silent. Every head turned toward the woman in the faded beige uniform, the one no one had ever asked. "Who were you before this?" For a moment, the entire grand hall seemed to hold its breath. Miranda's grip tightened on her bag strap, her gaze sharpening from disdain to unease. "Ms. Moore," she said, pronouncing each syllable as though testing something ridiculous on her tongue. "You're telling me she's going to perform the Hungarian Rhapsody in place of Olivia?" "Yes," Julian replied, unwavering. "I know it sounds strange, but she can do it." Philip DeWitt let out a sharp, venomous laugh. "Well, what's next? Let the custodian take the stage tonight, and tomorrow we'll have the cafeteria chef teaching music theory." Rachel had heard everything by now. She stood still, her hand tightening around the mop handle. Her eyes were steady, but inside, a storm raged. She was used to being overlooked. But this wasn't just invisibility. They were using her. Miranda turned, her face suddenly painted with the polish of a practiced politician. Actually, if we frame this the right way, it could be a fantastic media moment. A heartwarming community story to soften the blow of Olivia's absence. Philip nodded eagerly, chiming in, "If she crashes, we laugh it off and call it a community effort. If she pulls it off well, then we've unearthed a forgotten talent. Win-win." Both of them, the very people who had once looked down on her the most, were now negotiating how best to use her as a tool to save face. No one asked Rachel if she wanted to play. No one asked if it would hurt. Miranda turned to her then, her voice suddenly sugar-coated, unsettlingly gentle. "Ms. Moore, we truly appreciate your help. You'll perform just one piece, Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2. After that, you're free to return to your regular duties." Rachel lifted her head. For the first time, she looked Miranda directly in the eyes. "And if I say no?" Miranda smiled, a polished, practiced smile, but her eyes were ice. "Well, I'm afraid the board may have to re-evaluate your position here at the academy. Budgets are tightening. You see, I'm sure you understand." That wasn't an invitation. It was a warning. In that moment, Rachel saw it with piercing clarity. This wasn't about music. It wasn't about whether she could play. It wasn't about who she used to be. It was about them needing her to perform, not to shine, but to cover their cracks. She took a deep breath. Her hand still clutched the mop handle, but for the first time in years, her voice didn't tremble. "All right, I'll play." Rachel walked out of the grand hall in silence. The glass doors shut behind her with a hollow sound, like the quiet slam of a chapter closing. She didn't run, she didn't cry. But inside her, a storm churned not from fear of failure, but from the dread of being turned into a spectacle in a play she never asked to be part of. She wasn't invited. She was pushed on stage. The music that had once been the light of her life was now being used to polish the image of those who had always seen her as no more than a shadow. And perhaps most terrifying of all was that she had said yes. It took her several minutes to realize why she hadn't walked away. It wasn't because of the threat to her job. It wasn't to prove anything to Miranda or Philip. It wasn't for applause or redemption. Because something inside her had finally refused to stay silent. A part of her, the part that once loved every note, that once believed music could touch people's hearts, had awakened. And it would not be made into anyone's punchline. If she was going to play, then she would play with everything that was still left inside her soul. Not for them, but for herself. And for all the years she had been quiet. Night fell. The academy shimmered under golden lights. Guests filed in across the red carpet, laughter echoing under the soaring crystal ceilings. Glasses clinked, voices buzzed, and elegance draped every corner like silk. Behind the stage curtain of the grand auditorium, Rachel stood alone, still in her plain beige uniform, hair tied back, no makeup, no production, no titles. Just one name stitched on her chest, Rachel Moore. She looked out at the Steinway piano, gleaming under the spotlight. And for the first time in 15 years, she didn't see it as a lost dream. She saw it as an open door, but rather as a chance to finally say something she'd never dared to voice her entire life. I was once an artist. I have never stopped being one, whether you saw it or not. The clinking of silver against glass echoed through the auditorium like hollow, counterfeit notes. Guests chatted, laughed, raised their glasses of red wine, preoccupied with the crispness of their suits and the perfection of their gowns. No one noticed the woman in the janitor's uniform stepping onto the stage. Rachel walked into the spotlight beneath a sea of skeptical eyes and muffled whispers. Who is that? Is this a mistake? Are they seriously letting the cleaning lady perform from the side of the stage? Victoria, the event coordinator, approached the microphone, her smile tight, the kind that only came with damage control. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, our scheduled performer, Olivia Sanders, was unfortunately hospitalized earlier this evening. But, in the spirit of unity and community, we are pleased to present a very special substitute, one of the Academy's longtime staff members, Ms. Rachel Moore. Please give her a warm round of applause, a few polite claps, mostly awkward, some hesitant. Rachel took a breath. She didn't flinch, didn't smile. She simply walked across the stage, sat down at the Steinway, and adjusted the bench like she had done 1,000 times before, except this time, it wasn't someone else's performance she was preparing for. It was her own. The applause was scattered, a few half-hearted claps, a few smirks. Rachel didn't look at the audience. She looked only at the Steinway, as if the entire room had melted away, leaving just her, the piano, and the years that had been sleeping quietly in her chest. She sat, drew in a deep breath. Her fingers touched the keys, cold, smooth, like fate meeting her skin for the very first time. And in that instant, everything vanished. No grand hall, no doubting eyes, no hushed, mocking whispers. Rachel was back in that little room, years ago, back where her grandmother, Lillian, with her thin, weathered hands, sat beside her, smiling gently. Music isn't meant to win approval, sweetheart. It's where you finally get to be yourself. That memory became her downbeat. And then the first note rose, not shaky, not hesitant, not a cry for validation, just true. Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody, no, two. The sound of the piano filled the hall, not from her hands, but from a memory that had never lost its fire. Each chord was a piece of a life once lived. Each transition, a breathless sob she had once buried deep. The music didn't just echo through the auditorium, it ripped through the stifling air of prejudice and pride. In that moment, all the laughter stopped. All the whispers disappeared. Everyone from donors in tailored tuxedos to professors with folded arms, even those who had dismissed her for years, were caught in a single, unmoving breath. And the woman they had once called the cleaning lady was making the entire world hold its breath. At first, the silence was polite, nothing more than a gesture, a way not to interrupt this special performance that no one truly expected much from. A few tentative notes, a sweet story to tell over dessert. That's all they thought it would be. But then the silence shifted. It became stillness, then awe, then reverence. Because when the opening bars rang out precise, powerful, and impossibly pure, something changed in the room. The air itself seemed to listen. She wasn't playing the piece. She was living inside it. Each movement of her fingers rewrote a chapter of her life, the buried dreams, the unseen sacrifices, the nights she played alone on an old wooden piano just to remember what it felt like to breathe. Then came the middle section, the part where Liszt plunges the listener into a storm of frantic flourishes and pounding rhythms. Rachel poured everything into it, every emotion she had never been allowed to name. Her face no longer belonged to a janitor. She was an artist, a storyteller, a woman fully, fiercely alive. In the front row, the donors, the ones with six-figure checkbooks and practiced smiles, began to lean forward, captivated, eyes locked on her hands. In the far corner, a renowned music critic invited specifically to evaluate the Academy sat frozen, his back slowly sinking into the chair, eyes wide in disbelief, as if his ears had betrayed him. An elderly woman, her hair silver as snow, slowly raised a hand to wipe away a tear that had quietly traced down her cheek. A young freshman in the second row clutched the hem of her dress as if, for the very first time, she understood why she chose to study music. Backstage, Julian stood motionless. His eyes never left the woman on stage, the same woman who just hours earlier had been on her knees, scrubbing the legs of chairs. Now she was guiding an entire hall through a storm of emotion using only her music. And then the final crescendo. A furious rush of chords, powerful, unrelenting. And then silence, cut sharp, like lightning striking a clear sky. 3 seconds. Nothing but stillness. No one moved. And then one pair of hands clapped, then another. And then the entire hall erupted like rain pounding on glass, a thunderstorm of applause that could no longer be held back. Cries of bravo filled the room. People stood. Every single person stood. Some clapped until their palms burned. Others simply wept. No one remembered titles. No one saw the uniform Rachel was wearing. There was only one truth left in that room, undeniable, unshakable. True talent and the courage to live it can tear down any wall. Rachel rose from the bench and offered a gentle bow. Her expression was calm, not overly emotional, but in her eyes was something deeper than tears, release, freedom. As she stepped away from the piano, a man rose swiftly from the front row and made his way to the stage. The audience gasped in quiet recognition. It was Elliot Davenport, the legendary conductor and former juror for some of the world's most prestigious music festivals. He raised a hand, signaling the room to fall silent. "Miss," he began, his voice low and full of awe, "where did you learn that technique, the way you navigated the central cadenza? I've only ever seen that from world-class performers." Rachel stood tall, meeting his gaze. Her voice was soft, but somehow carried to every corner of the hall. "I didn't learn it anywhere, sir. At least, not in the way most people think." Elliot frowned slightly, intrigued, and the room held its breath. "My grandmother, Lillian Moore, was the principal pianist for the Savannah Symphony in the 1970s, Rachel said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. "She taught me everything, before I even knew how to read a score. When I got accepted into Juilliard, she had a stroke. I turned down the scholarship and stayed to take care of her. And time passed. Opportunities slipped away. But the music, it never left." A ripple of shock spread across the room like a quiet jolt of electricity. Lillian Moore. The name wasn't unfamiliar to anyone in the classical world. A prodigy of her time, a legend whose career had been cut short by family hardship. No one had imagined her granddaughter was here, pushing a mop through marble hallways. Elliot stared at Rachel for a long moment. Then he turned to the audience, his voice rich with conviction. If this is what a janitor looks like, then perhaps we all need to seriously reconsider how we define the word talent. At the back of the hall, Miranda Kingsley sat frozen, her face locked in a tight, brittle expression. The very words she had once spoken, the scorn, the thinly veiled contempt, now seemed to echo through the crowd like someone had put them on loudspeaker. But she said nothing. She couldn't. Philip clutched his wine glass so tightly his knuckles went white. He didn't dare lift his eyes to the stage. The mockery he once flung so casually now returned to him like a dull blade, dragging across his pride. And Julian stood exactly where he had been the entire time, silent, still, but his eyes gleamed not because Rachel had earned a standing ovation, but because she had finally stood up for herself. After a performance that left an entire auditorium on its feet, Rachel thought it was over. She didn't need more applause. She just wanted to quietly step off stage, retreat to the familiar shadows, remove the name tag from her chest, and for once in her life, sleep with peace in her heart. But just as she turned to leave, a woman stood up from the middle rows. She walked toward the stage with a calm grace, quiet but commanding. It was Clarissa Hale, director of the Shepherd Foundation, the Academy's largest and most influential patron of community music programs. At her side stood Elliot Davenport, still visibly moved, and Julian, who now made no attempt to hide the quiet pride in his eyes. Clarissa stepped forward and extended her hand, grasping Rachel's with steady, genuine respect. "Ms. Moore," she said, her voice resonant and clear, "I wasn't just moved by your performance tonight. I was moved by the quiet, unseen journey that led you here." The hall fell utterly silent. Our foundation is launching a new initiative called Keys to Hope, a program to bring high-quality music education to children in underserved communities. But to lead this, we don't need someone with titles. We need someone who knows what pain feels like, who knows what it means to dream in the dark, someone who believes in possibilities no one else can see. She paused, and for a moment, her eyes shimmered with something beyond admiration, belief. "We would like to invite you," Clarissa continued, her voice full of purpose, "to become co-founder and artistic director of the Keys to Hope program, a position where you'll teach, perform, and inspire." Rachel stood frozen, not because of the spotlight, but because, after all those years of being overlooked, she never imagined being invited into that world as herself. She turned to Julian, the one who had dared to believe what others couldn't see. He offered a quiet smile that seemed to say, "I always knew." Below the stage, the same people who once saw her only as the cleaning lady now whispered her name, not in ridicule, but in something that sounded like awe. Rachel took a deep breath, and then she nodded, not to rise, but to open a door for herself and for everyone who had ever been locked out simply for wearing the wrong uniform. Rachel Moore, once the woman quietly pushing a supply cart, head lowered beneath every gaze, now walked through the halls of Aldenridge with a stack of sheet music in her arms. No longer in the faded beige uniform, today she wore a simple navy blouse, a soft grey cardigan, and the same familiar flats, this time clean, grounded, and hers. She didn't walk fast, but every step had purpose. Everyone she passed greeted her a polite nod, a gentle "Good morning, Ms. Moore," not out of guilt, not for appearances, but because now they saw her. At the hallway intersection, Miranda Kingsley stood waiting, the same woman who once cast ice-cold glances in Rachel's direction. She stepped forward and stopped her. A pause, just long enough to sting. Then Miranda spoke, her voice low, firm, almost brittle. Congratulations. Ms. Moore, I think the Academy may have something to learn from you. Rachel smiled. Not with bitterness, not with sorrow, just grace. Thank you. And I've learned a lot from this place too. That answer, nothing more, nothing less, closed the chapter the way it was meant to end, not as revenge, but as resolution. Rachel stepped into practice room 207, the place where she would teach the very first class of the Keys to Hope program. In front of her sat 8 children. Each one carried eyes filled with a mix of curiosity, caution, and something fragile but bright hope. The same look she once had, long ago, when she first touched a piano beside her grandmother. Lillian. Rachel set the sheet music on the table, then eased herself onto the piano bench. The room fell still. No one spoke. They simply watched as the morning light spilled through the windows, illuminating the same hands that had once cleaned in silence, now ready to create something extraordinary. My grandmother used to say, Rachel began softly, music doesn't need a grand stage. As long as your heart wants to tell a story, anywhere can be a stage. She placed her fingers on the keys, and once more Rachel played. But this time, not to fight judgment, not to prove worth. This time, to begin a new journey, a new chapter. Not just for her, but for every soul in that room still waiting to believe that their story deserves to be heard. A journey to live authentically and to plant seeds for other dreams. Dreams not yet forgotten, but waiting quietly beneath the noise. Rachel's first class with Keys to Hope didn't begin with scales. It didn't start with theory or technique. It began with listening. The children in her classroom came from every corner of the city's quietest places, run-down apartments in South Savannah, tight homes where music rarely rose above the hum of an old TV or the harsh rhythms of adult arguments. Some had never touched a piano key. Some walked in with skeptical eyes, as if waiting for this, like everything else in their lives, to fall apart. But Rachel didn't teach them the traditional way. She didn't open with a lecture. She opened with a question. If music could speak for something inside you, what would it say first? It wasn't about notes. It was about voice. It was about letting children who had been talked over, talked past, or talked down to finally be heard. And in that quiet room, surrounded by second-hand instruments and first chances, something began to shift, not just in their hands, but in their hearts, because someone believed that their stories mattered. The question left the children puzzled, but slowly, bit by bit, the doubt began to fade. A quiet boy finally raised his hand and murmured, "I don't know how to make music, but I used to tap on the table when my parents fought, like to cover the sound." Another girl whispered, "I think music is like a hiding place, where no one yells at me for not saying anything." Rachel nodded. No corrections, no judgment. "Then today," she said, "we'll start there, with what you do have. No magic required, just courage." She showed them how to press a single note with intention, how to hear the resonance, how to feel the silence between two sounds. No rushing, no pressure, no tests. And after a few weeks, the scattered sounds turned into short melodies. After a few months, some of them started composing little fragments of music drawn entirely from their own feelings. No longer playing to escape, now playing to be heard. They began to believe music wasn't just a privilege for those who could afford a piano or had parents to drive them to a conservatory. Music was for everyone if someone had the patience to listen and the courage to give a chance. Rachel didn't need diplomas on the wall. She had something greater, the light in a child's eyes the moment they found their voice through a single note. And in those quiet moments, she knew. Sometimes, the most extraordinary miracles don't happen on grand stages. They happen in small rooms where a child dares to believe, "For the first time, I matter." Months later, in a humble, open rehearsal, Keys to Hope held its very first recital right inside Aldenridge Academy. The same place that once saw Rachel as no more than someone who cleaned the floors. That afternoon, the small performance hall where she had once been invisible was filled. Students, parents, and faces she never thought she'd see again. Familiar. And now, different. Miranda Kingsley sat in the second row, still in her impeccably pressed suit, still with that unreadable gaze. But this time, she brought no authority, only silence. Philip DeWitt sat by the aisle, gripping a notebook he never opened. He had just witnessed something far greater than theory, and he knew he had no more lessons to teach. The recital began. Children who once couldn't tell C from D now played short melodies, eyes alight, fingers trembling but proud. They didn't play perfectly, they played truthfully. When a thin girl finished a piece she had composed herself, the room erupted in applause. She bowed, her eyes shimmering with tears. Backstage, Rachel watched, quiet, still. She didn't need to walk out, didn't need her name to be called. Because real recognition doesn't come when others lower their heads, but when they finally lift their eyes and see you. After the performance, Miranda approached her. There was a pause, then a sigh. Perhaps. I didn't look long enough to really see. I'm sorry. Rachel looked at her, no longer angry, no longer wounded. Only understanding remained. There was a time, she said softly, when I couldn't see myself either. So I know how easy it is to look past someone. As for Philip, the man who once mocked her for suggesting a chord, he now stood quietly in the hallway, watching the children laugh and linger around the piano. When Julian came to stand beside him, Philip whispered, "She taught them things I forgot long ago." And it was true. Some lessons can't be found in any curriculum. They can't be measured in degrees or credentials, only in how deeply they reach the heart. Rachel no longer needed applause, because she finally understood the most profound change wasn't in being recognized, but in watching those who once laughed fall silent, just to listen. That afternoon, when the last student had gone home, the room remained. Only the slow falling light of evening slipping through the windows, and a quiet piano resting in the corner, waiting. Not to be seen, but to be heard. Rachel sat down. No syllabus, no audience. Just her and the sound waiting to be awakened. She placed her hands on the keys, slowly. No rush, no need for recognition. And then a melody emerged. Not quite Liszt, not quite Debussy, but something entirely hers. A piece with no name, buried in silence for years, now brought to life by fingers shaped by labor, rejection, and quiet resilience. And she thought, maybe every person carries a song that hasn't been played. Maybe it's hidden by fear, silenced by judgment, or simply buried under the lie. It's too late, but music never asks how long you've been lost. It only asks, are you ready to begin right here? Rachel once believed she had lost everything: her future, her talent, her faith. But the truth was, the most important things never really leave you. They wait for the moment you're brave enough to return and touch them again. No one can truly know what you're carrying in silence. Maybe it's a painting you haven't started, a poem you've been afraid to write, or just a simple sentence you've never dared to speak. I matter too. In a noisy world where value is measured by titles, clothes, or degrees, sometimes the bravest thing is not to rise above it all, but to stand still, fully, honestly, as yourself, and say, "I am me," and that is enough. Rachel had once disappeared in the very place she loved the most, but she didn't return to be seen. She came back so that others could finally see themselves. In life, there are people like Rachel, quiet, like background notes in a symphony, barely noticed, until the moment they choose to play their true song. And when they do, the world has no choice but to stop and listen. Maybe you, too, carry a piano inside your heart that's never been played. A dream wrapped in silence. A part of your soul you tucked away because someone once said, "You're not good enough." But remember, no one gets to define you, except you. A seed will never grow into a forest if it's afraid to begin in the dark. If this story touched you, share it, not for the views, but for someone out there struggling to believe in themselves, to hear just one thing: you're not invisible. You just haven't been truly heard yet. Endings are never the end. Every time you choose to believe in someone, that's when the music begins again. We'll see you in the next video, where the smallest moments can change the human heart.